It's really amazing what you can find sometimes at a thrift store. It's the Bob and Sherry
It's the Bob and
Oddcast,
Sherry
the Bob and Sherry
Oddcast, the Bob and
Oddcast.
Sherry
Come on in, you'll have a
Come on in, you'll
blast
have a
with the
blast.
Bob and Sherry Oddcast.
That was really grim. That was
really horrible.
about as grim as it could be.
You know, it's really interesting sometimes when you go into a thrift store. I was in one in Bangor, Maine. I think we were actually doing a remote broadcast from there. And I'm walking around, and you weren't with me. I was solo that day. And I'm walking around the thrift store and I'm going, oh, look at this vinyl section. And there was a section of, records, right? And I picked it up, and there was, you're too young to remember, Gary Lewis, who is Jerry Lewis, the comedian's son. And he had a band, and it was called Gary Lewis and the Playboys. And they actually had 4 or 5 really big hits, but he was not a really good singer. And I looked at it and I went, oh, yeah, I remember some of these songs. I never really liked this guy as a singer. And I turned it over and looked at the back of it. And there's a black and white photograph of Jerry Lewis, the famous comic, comedian, actor, next to his son, Gary Lewis. And Gary is showing him the album. And his father has the most pissed off look on his face.
Relatable.
I don't know why they chose that photograph. He's got to look like, what is this shit? You've never had a singing lesson in your life.
So I'm discovering for the first time that Jerry Lewis had a son that was a rock star, apparently. And I wonder if that photo wasn't chosen on purpose because Gary never felt like he had his famous father's approval. And this was his subtle way of signaling to the world, y'all, you think he's this goofy comedian, but what a dick he is to me. What do you think?
I get that, but I don't think the record company would allow that. I think they said one of the things that we have going here is he's the son of Jerry Lewis. This is the only photograph we could get. And Jerry would not play ball. He was going to be a real, pistol during this shoot. It's the only thing we've got, but we've got to do it. That's what I think. But anyway, I found a post that somebody did, and I don't know how long it took them to do this, but they found different items that people have photographed at different thrift stores around the United States. And let me just go through a couple of them here. There's a white T-shirt, and on the front of it, it looks like the Pizza Hut roof. You know the red Pizza Hut roof? Below it, there are dancing pieces of pizza, and the words are, the wife of the leader of the Church of Scientology, Shelley Miscavige, I don't know how to pronounce her last name.
Miscavige.
The wife of the leader of the Church of Scientology, Shelley Miscavige, has not been seen in public since 2007.
That is an actual legitimate scandal, by the way.
I didn't know that.
And the Church of Scientology is completely silent on her whereabouts. And you know what? I don't think she's even alive anymore. I think that there is a crime that's being covered up here. And as I'm saying this, Scientology is probably sending goons to break my door down. Max, what do you think about the Shelley Miscavige thing?
After watching Leah Remini, she really hammered this point, and the show that
about
she
the
had
wife
about Scientology. Yeah, I think that this is a genuine problem.
Why would I don't know, the FBI or somebody not look into that if it's that well known?
The Church of Scientology is a very mysterious and powerful organization. And the FBI, doesn't there have to be some probable cause for the feds to get involved? It has to cross state lines. I mean, the FBI, I can't find my favorite jeans and I can't get the FBI involved, right? There has to be something that would trigger that investigation. I think. Max, what do you know?
Yeah, I imagine that they do have to do that, but it is interesting to wonder why it has gone on this long that somebody hasn't tried to take some kind of legal action against it.
That's what I think, especially with all the publicity that Lisa gave to this issue.
Leah.
All right, let's continue. Some crazy things, and I think actually Karamia might be adding to it via Sherry. Crazy things that people have seen in thrift stores. This is Bob and Sherry, and we will be right back with the Oddcast.
All right, so we're talking about thrift stores. Now, I want to shout my kids out. They are big thrifters. Most of their clothes come from like Value Village or Salvation Army or yard sales or whatever. Now, you would think that that would mean I'm rolling in extra cash, but all of the money that Karamia doesn't spend on clothes gets vacuumed up by dance. So it's about, a break even. So we're at Dance Nationals in Sevierville, Tennessee, and their studio has a theme day every day. One day it's Unicorn Day, one day it's, Grandma Day. I don't know what all the days are. One of the days is Pajama Day. So Karamia and Danielle, they have like a whole afternoon off where they're not dancing because the little ones are dancing. They find a thrift store in, I don't know whether it was Pigeon Forge or Sevierville, but it was an enormous thrift store. And they go in there, and you want to talk about jackpot. Karamia came back to the cabin with a giant bag filled with what I think might be late 70s, early 80s cheap lingerie that was in pristine condition, that had clearly never been worn. But I recognized it because when I was a little girl, I had aunts and grandmothers who had that kind of stuff. And when I say lingerie, I'm not talking about, like a thong and a teddy. I'm talking about like nightgown kinds of things, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so I remember, I hadn't thought about it since I was a kid myself. She started pulling things out of the bag, and it was like I flashed back in time. So for Pajama Day, Karamia wore a coral-colored, white lace-trimmed, floor-length nightgown with a matching robe that goes over it, all polyester. But here's the thing that gets you: this was like 1980s polyester.
Yeah.
Compared to today's polyester, this was like a rare and precious silk. It was so like beautiful. The quality was so beautiful. The color was so intense, flawless. Then she whipped out this short nightgown that looks like a cross between a nightgown and a French maid costume. Again, all polyester, but like beautifully made with chiffon and lace and layers and pristine, brand new. Danielle whips out a pair of pale icy blue pajama bottoms and a robe, and they're just pulling one thing after another out of the bag and going, "Can you believe what we found at this thrift store?" And I was like, "Guys, I have a news flash for you. Somebody's Meemaw just died, and the family cleaned out the house, and there were 2 drawers in Meemaw's bedroom that were stacked with this stuff that Meemaw hasn't looked at or worn since the 80s, and certainly hasn't used since Peepaw went to heaven about 10 years earlier. This is someone's grandmother's pajama drawer." And they just thought that was hilarious. And they were like, "Well, we're going to be paying tribute." And so that's what they'll be wearing for Pajama Day at the dance convention.
That
and
is
you
a
could
hoot.
you could tell that that's what it was, that someone had just gone in and wiped out grandma's belongings and donated them all to charity. And it was an amazing find. The quality, the colors, all of it.
Is there not something, because you did say, I mean, at first I thought it was unopened, but you did say that she hadn't worn it in a long time. Is there something that's just a little creepy putting on grandma's nightie?
Well, that's the thing about when you buy your stuff vintage and secondhand. Those clothes have a story to tell. I didn't get the feeling that this stuff had really ever been worn. It didn't look like it had ever been worn, especially the little fetishy French maid thing. I'm pretty sure Peepaw got a notion and brought that home, and Meemaw was like, "Not on your life, John," and put it in a drawer and never touched it again. That's how brand new everything felt. It was
or maybe
so
Meemaw
flawless.
put it on and maybe Meemaw wore it for him and it killed him. That's what killed him.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe that's what sent him over the Rainbow Bridge.
Yeah.
But it was just such an interesting assortment of things that maybe a guy wouldn't know that, but as a woman, I looked at that and knew instantly that I was looking at 30 or possibly 40-year-old things. Because if you buy like, again, cheap, like not fancy designer, not silk. If you buy cheap nylon and polyester stuff like that today at Walmart, or that quality is not there. This was vintage, cheap, sexy nightgown lingerie kind of stuff. It was absolutely wild to see it coming out of the bag.
If it's 70s and 80s polyester, though, don't let her stand near a candle.
Oh, no kidding. Like, it's totally flammable. And then there were a couple of other things that were definitely more like Fredericks of Hollywood feeling. Like, just there was like the nightgown bathrobe combo that Karamia got and the one that Danielle got were very appropriate for pajama day because they were actual pajamas. But there were a couple of things that came out of that bag where I was like, well, Pappy was a kinky old thing, wasn't he, back in the day? This really feels like Fredericks of Hollywood.
Yeah, he was lucky. He was lucky.
It was just something. And when you go vintage shopping, you're not just buying like a really cool thing at a great price. You're buying a tiny fragment of another person's life, another person's story.
You know, when my father died, we donated his clothing. And it was my job to do that. You know, obviously my mother was very upset. And I remember going into his closet and pulling out his sport jackets and his pants and all these other things. And then I looked down on the floor and he had, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 pairs of shoes, including some more formal shoes that you would wear with a suit. He didn't wear a suit all that often, didn't have to. And I picked them up and you can see how they were worn in. And I thought at that moment, I don't know if there's anything that we possess as human beings that is more personal than shoes. And I thought, you know, I'm just going to get rid of these. They need to go away. For some reason, I didn't want them. And I don't even know if you can give shoes because of health reasons to a place like that. But I stood there looking at his shoes and you could see how his foot, you know, moved in them and how old they were and what was the heel like. What is more personal? Forget about underwear, but what is more personal, a connection to your body than your shoes?
I totally agree. I actually have a story about shoes that I've never forgotten it and I've never really understood it. So I'll tell it to you guys, and maybe because you're men, it'll hit differently for you and you'll be able to tell me what it meant. Okay. So someone I know, his parents divorced when the kids were little and both sets of parents remarried. And his stepfather, things started out okay, but the stepfather, things gradually went dark. He had a pretty intense drinking problem, but he managed it. He was one of those people that had a serious alcohol problem, but he was able to keep everything kind of going, you know, kept the job going. But when he drank, he was really, really awful. He was violent and verbally aggressive and physically abusive toward all of the kids except for one. I mean, it was bad. He'd come at the kids with his fists. He was a real fucking asshole. Okay. And one night after work, before he came home, he stopped off and he had a drink. And I know that he was not intoxicated when what happened because they did the toxicology, but he was extremely sleep deprived because he had worked a couple of double shifts in a row at his job. So he was pretty tired and he stopped for a drink, and it was about a half an hour ride home, and he fell asleep at the wheel, lost control of the car, and he was killed in a car accident that night. And it was really tragic because even though he was, as I said, like a giant piece of dickishness masquerading as a man, he was still, you know, somebody's husband, somebody's father, somebody's brother and son. These things are always tragic. So the guy that I'm talking about at that point had moved out of the house and no longer lived there. He got the middle of the night phone call. Your stepfather's been killed in an accident. Come home. So he comes home and they go through the awful aftermath of a tragedy like this. You know, it's just so shocking and unexpected. And when you have, for anyone listening who has had an experience where there's a person in your family who's kind of just a monster, the grief that you experience when that person dies is very complicated. Like I went through this when my own father died. It's a complicated kind of grief, because you're grieving the loss of an idea as much as you are the loss of a person. You know, you're grieving the idea of a father,
yeah,
right?
That's true. Mm-hmm.
But your grief is also mingled with other feelings. Some of those feelings might even be described as relief, because as awful as it is that he's gone, with him goes the unpredictable violence, the heaviness that hangs over the house. You know, it's a complicated.
I know what you're talking about. I knew a woman once, and she was married for many, many years. It was that generation where you just didn't divorce no matter what. And she was married to him for many, many years, and he was abusive verbally, a little bit physically, but just an absolute drain of energy and joy. And when he died, we went over to her house, and I was watching her. I think I was late teens, early 20s, and I was watching her, and I did not see somebody that had just been struggling with red eyes from tears all morning long. She was sad, she was composed, she was somber, but there was something about her that was lighter than the last time that I saw her. And I think it was because that burden and that oppression, even though it was caused by tragedy, was lifted.
I mean, I can speak to that from experience. And if there's someone listening there out there right now that's carrying a weight of very complicated grief, when my father died, I grieved not the man that he was, but the man that he had never been. But I also felt, and I grieved that I didn't have a dad that I could grieve. And I grieved that there just was no hope of anything ever being mended, right? But I also, for the first time in my whole life, was no longer afraid of him. Like he had gone to a place where he couldn't reach me. And I sincerely hope that wherever he went, it's better than what he knew here, because he was a very desperately tortured and unhappy man. So back to this person that I know. So the stepfather's been killed. It's an unbelievable shock. It's an unbelievable experience to go through. And they go through the funeral, and my friend goes to his mom and says, "Can I have so-and-so's shoes?" And she's like, "What?" And he pointed to the shoes that his stepfather had always worn to work. His stepfather wore a uniform to work, and these very specific sort of kind of grown-ass fancy man dress shoes that went with this uniform. "Can I have the shoes?" And his mom was like, "I don't even know that they'll fit you." And he goes, I just want the shoes. And he took the shoes and he went back. He lived a few hours away. He gets home, and there the shoes are in his house, and he sits them down. And the shoes had a presence and a heaviness about them, not unlike the man that they had once belonged to. And every once in a while, my friend would put these shoes on and wear them for a little bit and think about the stepfather. And try to find a way to grieve him. Try to find a way to feel something other than relief that the man was gone, right?
Wow.
And he literally thought that if he walked a mile in the man's shoes, if he literally walked in the man's shoes, that he might find his way. He might find a path to some kind of a grief that to him would feel less shameful and angry and less joyful, right? And he would sit there with these shoes on and try to find his way. And he ultimately couldn't. And so the shoes were donated, and God knows where they are today, right? But that was how he tried, because grief makes us crazy, and we do such irrational things when we're grieving. His grief was so complicated and so irrational that was what he could think to do. And he said the same thing you said, Bob, about how personal shoes are. He was like, the first time I put them on, I knew that I was wearing his shoes. They felt like him because they were leather and they had molded and all of it. And standing and walking in those shoes felt uncomfortable and off balance and just so strange and surreal. And I never forgot that story because is the most literal attempt I've ever known anyone to make at trying to figure out who this person that was such a difficult presence in his life was. It was just
Listen, that was well told,
attempt.
and good for him for doing that. It's an interesting little endeavor. I'm surprised something like that has not been a scene in a movie.
Yeah, I never really thought about it.
Directed by Clint Eastwood.
I mean, have you ever known anyone to do anything like I just described?
No, I've been thinking about shoes. It isn't funny, the tangent you go off on sometimes. I've been thinking about my father's shoes and what you're talking about and what this fella did. And it's funny. I have never seen in any home that I've been in a pair of the father's shoes or even the mother's shoes, like in a bookcase. That wouldn't have to have some sort of a sign or, a plaque or something like that. But, a lot of people will have those big bookcases where they'll put some pictures along with some books and some decorative art. If you had a big one, that would be a perfect thing just to subtly put up there. And maybe if somebody asked, you would say, I've never seen that done anywhere.
Well, isn't it funny how we bronze baby shoes?
Yeah.
Like I still have, I have all of Karamia's ballet shoes going back to age 3. And they start out tiny and they get bigger and bigger. I have them all in a box. Now, Max did have his baby shoes bronzed, but Max was so gigantic as a baby that his baby shoes fit Heather, our digital director.
We put her foot next to my bronze baby shoe. It's about the same size.
That's so interesting. I bet, somebody listening to this now might remember this and might do that. I don't know that I would have done that, given a complicated relationship too, but I could see how it would be an interesting part of your home decor, and certainly personal.
The guy with the stepfather's shoes, there were other aspects about those shoes that were haunting for him. Like, he would come home from work in his uniform in those shoes, and he'd have a few to unwind. And that's when things would often get belligerent and dark. And the sound of those shoes coming down the hallway, right?
Oh yeah.
That was that was a trigger. The sight of those shoes, like if you were lying on the floor watching TV and those shoes went walking past you, and listening to the clink of the ice in the glass, the sight of those shoes was a trigger. I think that for him, those shoes became like the receptacle, like the Horcrux for my Harry Potter fans out there. Those shoes were a Horcrux for all of the frightening and heartbreaking aspects of the relationship he had with that man.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting that ultimately he donated them. And what that to me says is he may have walked a mile or two in that man's shoes, but he never really understood him and why he acted that way.
He never did. And after a while, the knowledge that the shoes were in the closet, it was a Horcrux. The shoes, you're not a Harry Potter fan, so let me explain real quick, Bob. A Horcrux is an object that contains part of a person's soul. So it's a very powerful, magical object, right? And part of its power derives from the fragment of like a soul that's in there. And if the soul is a dark wizard or a bad person, then the object has that dark magnetic pull, right? So that makes sense.
So my Horcrux would have been the last condo I couldn't sell.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So for my friend, the shoes became a malevolent presence in his apartment.
I could see that.
They were tucked away in a closet, but he knew they were there. He could feel them there, and he could feel the weight of them there. And they got donated, not because he reached a point of healing or understanding, but because he could no longer live with that object in his house because they were so personal. And they were so loaded and heavy with meaning. And I've often wondered, because they were nice shoes, apparently, from what I was told. I never saw them, but they were like really fancy shoes because the stepfather had a really fancy job that required a fancy uniform. Those shoes were probably scooped up by somebody who needed to wear them to a job interview or to church or whatever. And maybe those shoes, by going into a stranger's hands who had no history with the violent stepfather, maybe those shoes brought somebody, a whole bunch of miles of happier walking. You can hope, right?
And that's the way that it ends. That's the way the movie ends.
Yeah.
With this one person going into a thrift store, trying them on, and then he walks into, I don't know, an interview or something, and his life is about to go in a different direction.
And he gets the job. Kind of the way to bring this all full circle. Once upon a time, Peepaw went to Nashville on business, and he went into a fancy underwear store, and he saw some stuff, and he thought, boy, my wife would look good in that. And he packed it all up, and he brought it all home to Gatlinburg, and he gave it to his wife. And she looked at that, and she looked at him, and she thought, when hell freezes over, old man. And she put it in a drawer and tucked it away, and they never spoke of it again. And then she died, and the kids donated it to the Value Village. And today, my daughter's walking around the Sevierville Convention Center in it for Pajama Day. You just never know.
You just never know.
Where things
That's right.
are going to go.
Thank you, folks, for listening. And maybe we gave you some, ideas for hopefully not the near future, but somewhere way down the road in your family's history.
And remember, when you see something real fancy that may have been somebody else's underwear, just run it through the washer with some Tide and some Clorox too. It'll be fine. That's it for today's episode of the Oddcast. Our website is BOBANDSHERI. Love to hear from you. You can drop us an email there or a talkback message when you download our app, free in Google Play and the Apple Store. New episodes of the Oddcast every Monday and Friday. Check out Fun Size. It's about 10 minutes long, hosted by Max, snack size and perfect for sharing. Y'all take care of yourselves and be nice to each other, and make sure that when you have a chance to wear your Mima's old negligee, you jump on it. And we'll see you next time on the Oddcast. Hey, thank you so much for listening to the Bob and Sherry podcast and the Bob and Sherry Oddcast. We would love if you would subscribe, rate and review, and share it with a friend on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, wherever you go. And thank you again for listening.